Carved into clay tablets nearly 5,000 years ago in a language we spent centuries struggling to decode, the Sumerians left behind something extraordinary. Not just hymns, not just tax records, not just king lists, but a cosmology. A story of beings they called the Anunnaki, those who came down from heaven to earth. Beings of immense power who arrived in the ancient world with purpose, with knowledge, and according to the oldest surviving written accounts, with urgency. And here is the question that has quietly unsettled scholars, mythologists, and astronomers alike for over 150 years. What were they running from? The Sumerian tablets don't simply describe gods at leisure. They describe gods in motion, gods with missions, gods carrying something forward through time, as though something behind them could not be allowed to catch up. Welcome, friend. I'm genuinely glad you're here tonight. It might be late where you are, the house settling into its nighttime, quiet, the day finally loosening its grip on your shoulders. And that's exactly the right moment for a journey like this one. Thank you for choosing to spend these hours here, in the company of ancient questions and older stars. What makes the Anunnaki so persistently fascinating across generations of scholars and independent researchers is that they sit at the precise intersection of mythology, history, and genuine archaeological mystery. The mainstream scholarly position held by Assyriologists and cuneiform specialists at institutions from Oxford to the Oriental Institute in Chicago is well-reasoned and carefully evidenced. The Anunnaki were the great gods of the Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian pantheons, divine beings who governed fate, who sat in cosmic assembly, who decreed the destinies of kings and harvests and floods. They were, in this reading, sophisticated theological constructions, metaphors embedded in one of humanity's earliest attempts to make sense of existence. But alongside that interpretation, another reading has persisted, championed by figures like Zecharia Sitchin in the 20th century, and debated with genuine passion ever since. In this view, the Anunnaki texts encode something more literal, a memory of actual arrivals, actual knowledge transfers, actual beings whose origins lay somewhere beyond the familiar horizon of the ancient Near East. Sitchin's translations remain controversial among professional linguists, and that controversy is legitimate and worth understanding. Yet the underlying question he was responding to, why do these texts feel so different from ordinary mythology? Why do the Anunnaki seem less like symbolic archetypes and more like historical actors with agendas and anxieties? That question has never been fully put to rest. Both interpretations deserve a seat at the fire tonight. We are not here to settle this debate. Honestly, I'm not sure the debate wants to be settled, and I'm not sure we'd be wiser for settling it prematurely. What we're here to do is something older and perhaps more honest, to sit with the question, to feel the weight of 5,000 years of human wondering, and to ask alongside every scribe and priest and archaeologist who came before us, what were they really trying to tell us? What did the people of ancient Sumer know, or remember, or fear? That wondering is not weakness. It is, I'd argue, the most ancient intellectual tradition we have. Take a breath now, a slow one, all the way down. Notice where you are, the particular quality of dark or dim light around you, the weight of your body finding its rest. Maybe you're in bed, maybe a chair, maybe somewhere in between. Wherever you are, let it hold you completely. You don't need to go anywhere tonight. The ancient world is already coming to meet you. If content like this, patient, curious, grounded in genuine history and genuine wonder, is something you value, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video or subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing, and it helps other people who are searching for exactly this kind of thoughtful late-night company find their way here. Thank you, truly. Now, let your mind travel back, not just centuries, but millennia. Back beyond Rome, beyond Greece, beyond Egypt's first pyramid, back to a flat and fertile land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what is now southern Iraq. The Sumerians called it Kalam, the Black Land, the civilized land, the place where order was first wrested from wilderness. Here, around 3,500 BCE, something remarkable happened that we still don't entirely understand. Writing emerged. Cities emerged. Complex astronomy emerged. Legal codes emerged. Temple complexes rose from the river plain with a speed and sophistication that continues to prompt serious questions among archaeologists about what, exactly, preceded them. The tablets they left behind number in the hundreds of thousands. Many still unread, still waiting in museum storage, still locked in a script that took the combined effort of 19th century European scholars decades to crack. And among those tablets, distributed across the great library of Ashurbanipal, at Nineveh, across temple archives at Nippur and Ur and Eridu, the oldest city of all, there are stories. Stories of the Anunnaki, not as distant symbols, but as present, active, purposeful beings who arrived with specific knowledge and specific concerns, who created and organized and instructed, and who, in the oldest layers of the tradition, seemed to carry within them the memory of somewhere else. Somewhere they had been before. Somewhere, perhaps, they were still trying to leave behind. That is where we begin. Long before the first reed stylus pressed into wet clay, long before the first ziggurat rose above the southern marshes, there was only the land itself, patient and indifferent, shaped by forces that had nothing to do with human ambition. The territory we now call Mesopotamia, from the Greek meaning simply the land between the rivers, was not always the fertile agricultural plain that cradled civilization. It was something older, wilder, and in geological terms, remarkably recent. The Persian Gulf, that body of water that today separates the Arabian Peninsula from Iran, extended much further north than it does now, reaching deep into what would become the heartland of Sumerian culture. The land that Eridu would one day stand on was, for a very long time, underwater. Consider what that means for a moment. The oldest Sumerian city, Eridu, the city their own texts describe as the first city ever built, the place where kingship descended from heaven according to the Sumerian king list, sat at the edge of a receding sea. Archaeologists excavating Eridu in the 1940s and 1950s, led by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd of the Iraqi Directorate of Antiquities, found 18 successive layers of temple construction on the same sacred spot, reaching back to approximately 5,400 BCE. Beneath the earliest temple, they found fish bones, thousands of them, offerings perhaps, or simply the dietary evidence of a people living at the boundary between land and water, between the known world and whatever lay beyond the southern horizon. The rivers themselves were different then. The Tigris and Euphrates carried heavier sediment loads, ran broader and shallower in places, and flooded with a seasonal violence that modern river management has largely erased from living memory. Spring floods deposited rich silts across the alluvial plain, rebuilding the soil year after year in thin, dark layers that accumulated over millennia into some of the most agriculturally productive land on Earth. That fertility was not gentle. It arrived with force, with noise, with the smell of churned riverbed and uprooted reed, and it receded, leaving behind a landscape transformed, glistening, quietly teeming with possibility. The climate of this period, roughly 6,000 to 4,000 BCE, was measurably different from today. Scholars refer to the Holocene climatic optimum, a period when global temperatures ran approximately 1 to 2 degrees Celsius warmer than present, when monsoon patterns reached further north and west than they do now, and when the regions bordering the Arabian Peninsula and the Fertile Crescent received significantly more rainfall. The land that is today arid scrub and desert was then dotted with seasonal lakes, crossed by streams that no longer exist, and fringed with vegetation that would be unrecognizable to anyone who visited the region now. Stars wheeled overhead in skies untouched by any artificial light. On clear nights, and most nights were clear, the Milky Way stretched from horizon to horizon with an intensity that modern eyes almost never experience. The people who would eventually become the Sumerians looked up at those skies with the same biological hardware we carry now, the same pattern-seeking minds, the same instinct to find meaning in repetition and cycle, and what they saw above them was not chaos, but order, a vast rotating clock whose hands were the planets and whose face was the seasonal procession of constellations. Perhaps that sky was the first text. Perhaps the need to read it, to record it, to pass its patterns to the next generation was among the earliest impulses that nudged human communities toward writing. The land was filling, slowly, with people who were learning to remember. Where the two rivers finally slowed and spread into the southern marshes, the world became something between solid and liquid, a landscape of negotiation between earth and water that has no easy modern equivalent. Picture it at dawn, around 5000 BCE, the light arriving flat and golden across reed beds that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, the air carrying the particular thickness of standing water mixed with pollen and mud, the sound of waterfowl dense enough to register as a kind of weather. This was the world at the edge of what would become civilization, and it was not empty. It was astonishingly full. The marsh Arabs, the Madan, who inhabited this same landscape until Saddam Hussein drained much of it in the 1990s, lived in ways that archaeologists believe closely paralleled the earliest Mesopotamian communities. They built island platforms from bundled reeds, constructed elaborate houses from the same material, navigated by narrow wooden boats, and organized their lives around the seasonal rhythms of water and fish and migratory birds. When we try to imagine the world the Proto-Sumerians inhabited before the cities rose, this is among our closest living reference points, and it speaks to a life of considerable sophistication, considerable intimacy with natural systems, and considerable patience. Reed architecture deserves more attention than it typically receives. The Mudhif, the great communal hall of the Madan, built entirely from bundled giants, reeds, some structures reaching 15 meters in length and 5 meters in height, required no nails, no mortar, no fired brick. The reeds were bent into arches, interlocked with a precision that distributed weight elegantly, and lashed with fiber in patterns that experienced builders could execute entirely from memory. Structures like these were being built in the southern marshes, thousands of years before writing recorded their existence. They represent a technical tradition of genuine complexity, passed down not in texts, but in hands, in posture, in the apprenticed eye. The rivers brought more than water. They carried obsidian from volcanic sources in eastern Anatolia, lapis lazuli that had traveled overland from mines in what is now northeastern Afghanistan, copper from deposits in the Zagros foothills to the east. These materials appear in the earliest Mesopotamian archaeological layers, which tells us something important. The communities forming in this river delta were not isolated. They were already embedded in long-distance exchange networks whose full geography we are still mapping. Someone was moving things across enormous distances, long before cities existed to organize the trade. At night, when the marsh sound shifted from the calls of herons and ibis to the lower register of frogs and nightjars, the sky above the flat delta landscape was a planetarium of extraordinary clarity. Ancient Mesopotamian astronomical records, preserved in later cuneiform tablets, demonstrate an observational tradition of remarkable depth. The Venus tablet of Amisadika, dating to around 1700 BCE, but believed to encode observations stretching back centuries earlier, records the rising and setting of Venus across a 21-year cycle with accuracy that still impresses modern astronomers. That precision was not invented overnight. It accumulated through generations of patient watching, patient recording, patient wondering about what the patterns meant. Something was gathering in this landscape. Population, yes, and agricultural knowledge, and the slow accumulation of craft specialization. But also something harder to name, a pressure toward organization, toward permanence, toward the impulse to carve into lasting material what the mind alone could not reliably hold. The reeds bent in the evening wind coming off the water. The stars rotated overhead in their ancient courses, and somewhere in the interplay between human memory and the need to extend it beyond a single lifetime, the idea of writing was approaching. Before the Anunnaki were named in writing, they existed in something older than writing, in the oral traditions, the ritual practices, the cosmological intuitions of people who had been watching the sky and the river for generations beyond counting. Every culture that achieves sufficient complexity eventually turns to the sky for its deepest organizing metaphors, and the Proto-Sumerian communities of the southern alluvial plain were no exception. But what emerges from the earliest recoverable layers of Sumerian religious thought is not simply sky worship or nature personification. It is something more structured, more hierarchical, and in some ways more anxious than that. The Sumerian cosmos was organized around the concept of Me, a Sumerian word that scholars translate variously as divine laws, civilizing forces, or the fundamental decrees that govern existence. The Me were not abstract philosophical concepts. They were innumerable. The Sumerian text known as Inanna and Enki lists over 100 of them, including kingship, descent into the underworld, the scribal arts, weaponry, the craft of the smith, the descent of music, even the art of being a prostitute. The Me were things that could be held, carried, stolen, and bargained for. They were, in some readings, more like technologies than commandments, the specific packages of knowledge and practice that separated ordered civilization from chaos. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is genuinely unusual in the landscape of ancient religion. Most early religious systems organized the cosmos around forces, around a sky god's will, or a fertility goddess's cycle, or the whims of weather and harvest. The Sumerians did this too, but they layered over it something additional, a bureaucratic cosmology in which civilization itself was a specific set of transmissible competencies, things that had been brought from somewhere, deposited in human hands, and could theoretically be taken away. The Me resided originally with the god Enki at his temple at Eridu, the Abzu, the house of the deep waters. They were kept there, managed, curated. The cosmological implication is subtle but significant. Civilization was not simply what humans naturally developed. It was something they had been given. By whom and from where? The texts are not entirely consistent on this point. But the Anunnaki are present throughout the earliest recoverable layers of this tradition, described in the Sumerian text known as the debate between bird and fish, as those who had established the divine laws, and in the Atrahasis epic, dating in its written form to around 1700 BCE, but in coding traditions considerably older, as beings who arrived on Earth with specific purposes and found themselves, after a very long time, in conflict with the consequences of their own decisions. The stars continued their rotations, indifferent to the questions accumulating beneath them. The Euphrates deposited another thin layer of silt across the plain, as it had done every spring for 10,000 years. And in the slow growth of human communities along its banks, something was crystallizing, a readiness, a reaching toward the kind of permanence that only writing can provide. The stage was set. The actors, both human and otherwise, were assembling. And the oldest story ever recorded in human language was preparing, at last, to be written down. The moment George Smith sat in the British Museum in 1872 and read a Babylonian flood story that predated the biblical account by at least 1,000 years, the scholarly world shifted on its foundations. Smith, a self-taught Assyriologist who had begun his career as an engraver's apprentice before his obsessive study of cuneiform tablets brought him to the museum's attention, recognized what he was holding with a certainty that reportedly caused him to stand up, pace the room, and begin removing his clothing in a state of overwhelmed excitement. The tablet he was reading was part of the collection excavated from the Great Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, assembled by the Assyrian king around 650 BCE from older sources, some of them already ancient by his time. What Smith had found was the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and within it, a flood narrative of unmistakable familiarity. But the flood story was not the most quietly unsettling thing in that library. The Nineveh tablets, numbering somewhere between 20 and 30,000 fragments, contained within them traces of Sumerian originals that predated the Assyrian copies by over 1,000 years. The Anunnaki appeared throughout this material, not incidentally, but centrally, as organizing presences in the cosmic architecture the text described. In the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest narrative texts we possess, the Anunnaki are present from the opening lines, described as gods who had taken on the burden of labor, digging rivers and canals, performing the physical work of making the earth habitable, and eventually growing exhausted and rebellious under the weight of their toil. The text describes their complaint with a specificity that reads less like mythology and more like a labor dispute. They had been working, the text says, for 3,600 years. That number is not incidental. In the Sumerian sexagesimal counting system, the base 60 mathematics that gave us our 60-minute hour and our 360-degree circle, 3600, was a unit called ASAR, a complete cycle. The Anunnaki's period of labor was described in a unit of cosmic completion, suggesting that their arrival and their toil were understood not as random events, but as part of a larger temporal architecture, a schedule of some kind, operating on scales that dwarfed ordinary human time. Carved into the tablets at Nippur, one of the great religious centers of ancient Sumer, are fragments of what scholars call the Sumerian king list, a document that records the rulers of Sumerian cities from before the flood to the historical period. The pre-flood kings are listed with reigns of implausible length, tens of thousands of years each, and the text states plainly that kingship descended from heaven, was disrupted by the flood, and then descended from heaven again. The Anunnaki are present at both descents. Whether these enormous numbers encode astronomical cycles, as some researchers have proposed, or represent a symbolic assertion of divine continuity, as mainstream scholarship generally holds, the structure itself is remarkable. A civilization recording its own history as beginning not with human initiative, but with arrival from elsewhere. The physical tablets carry their own sensory testimony. Cuneiform script pressed into clay with a reed stylus produces wedge-shaped impressions approximately 2 to 5 millimeters in depth, each one requiring a deliberate measured pressure to execute correctly. Holding a replica, as museum visitors can do at the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, the tablet feels heavier than expected, dense and cool, the surface slightly rough where the clay dried unevenly. The text covers nearly every available surface, packed with an economy that suggests the scribes understood they were working in a medium of finite space and permanent consequence. These were not casual recordings. The people making them understood they were preserving something that mattered, something that needed to survive beyond their own lifetimes and memories. The question that lingers quietly over every tablet in every collection is whether the Sumerians believed they were recording history or mythology, and whether that distinction, so important to us, meant anything at all to them. In the autumn of 1946, the Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar arrived at a low mound rising from the flat desert of southern Iraq, roughly 20 kilometers southwest of the ancient city of Ur, in a region so remote that the nearest modern settlement was hours away by the dirt tracks that passed for roads. The mound was called Tel Abu Shahrain, and local people had known it was something ancient for as long as anyone could remember, but systematic excavation had never been attempted. Safar, working with Muhammad Ali Mustafa and later with Seton Lloyd, set up camp beside the mound in the particular dry heat of the Iraqi autumn and began to dig. What they found over the following seasons fundamentally changed the understanding of Mesopotamian prehistory. Beneath the uppermost ruins, they encountered a sequence of temples built one upon another on the same spot, each new structure raised directly over the foundations of its predecessor, the oldest layers reaching down through 5 meters of accumulated human history to a period archaeologists now date to approximately 5,400 BCE. The lowest temple was a single room, roughly 3 meters by 4 meters, built of hand-formed mud brick, with a central offering table and evidence of fish bones and animal remains that had been burned or deposited as offerings. The structure was modest by any measure, but it was old in a way that recalibrated everything above it. Safar and his team had found Eridu, the city the Sumerian king list named as the first city, the place where kingship first descended from heaven, the home of the god Enki, and his temple, the Iabzu, the house of the deep waters. The archaeological evidence aligned with the textual tradition in a way that made scholars simultaneously excited and cautious, because the alignment raised a question with no comfortable answer. If the Sumerians were right about Eridu being first, what else in their cosmological record deserved a second, more careful look? The 18 successive temple layers at Eridu represent an unbroken religious continuity spanning roughly 2,000 years, from 5,400 BCE to around 3,500 BCE. The same sacred spot was rebuilt, expanded, and elaborated generation after generation, each community choosing to honor the location rather than abandon it. By the time the uppermost temple was constructed, the structure had grown to a platform measuring approximately 23 meters by 17 meters, with buttressed exterior walls and an interior that showed evidence of ritual fire, liquid offerings, and deliberate deposition of objects, including carved cylinder seals and small figurines of a distinctive type, elongated with reptilian facial features, found nowhere else in the archaeological record in quite the same form. Those figurines have generated considerable discussion. Mainstream archaeology categorizes them as cultic objects of uncertain specific meaning, possibly representing priests in ritual costume, possibly depicting a deity associated with Enki's watery domain. They are made from fired clay, stand between 8 and 15 centimeters tall, and carry their infants in the same elongated arm posture. The strangeness of their appearance is genuine and not easily explained away, and the honest answer is that we don't know with certainty what they represent. The air above the Eridu mound in the early morning, before the desert heat builds, carries a particular stillness. The landscape is almost entirely flat in every direction, the horizon a thin line between pale earth and paler sky. Standing there, it is possible to understand why the Sumerians considered this location sacred in a way that transcended ordinary religious habit. There is something at the edge of the known world that compels a certain kind of attention, a certain reaching toward the vertical, toward height, toward heaven. The first temple at Eridu was built when the Anunnaki tradition was already taking shape in oral memory. The tablets that would eventually record their stories were still 2,000 years in the future. But the sacred ground was already being consecrated, already being returned to, already being remembered as the place where something important had first touched down. Reading the Sumerian texts directly, in translation by specialists who have spent careers with the language, produces an experience quite different from reading popular summaries of their content. The language is concrete, economical, and surprisingly specific. It does not typically traffic in the vague grandeur that later religious texts sometimes prefer. When the Anunnaki are described doing something, the texts tend to say what they were doing, where they were doing it, and in some cases, why they were dissatisfied with the results. The Atrahasis epic opens with a cosmological situation already in progress. The great Anunnaki, the text specifies, numbered 7, and they had assigned the lesser gods, called the Igigi, to the labor of maintaining the earth's waterways. The Igigi dug the Tigris, they dug the Euphrates. They worked for what the text describes as 3,600 years before throwing down their tools in revolt, surrounding the house of the chief god Enlil in the night, and demanding relief from their burden. The resolution was the creation of humanity, specifically to take over the labor the Igigi could no longer bear. This narrative structure is unusual in world mythology and worth examining carefully. Most creation myths position humanity as the crown of creation, the intended purpose of a cosmos designed with human flourishing in mind. The Atrahasis epic positions humanity differently, as a solution to a labor shortage. Humans were created in this account not out of divine love or cosmic necessity, but out of organizational pragmatism to do work that others had grown tired of doing. The implications of that framing extend in several directions simultaneously, and scholars have been unpacking them for over a century without exhausting the possibilities. The specific language used for the creation of humans in Atrahasis involves the Anunnaki god Enki and the birth goddess Nintu working together, mixing clay with the flesh and blood of a slain god, a being identified as We'ila, who possessed the intelligence necessary to transmit divine capacity to the new creature. The resulting human carried, according to the text, the imprint or spirit of the god within the clay of the body. This is not a metaphor the text is reaching for. It states the mechanism plainly, as though recording a procedure. Cylinder seals from the early dynastics, period, roughly 2900 to 2350 BCE, found at sites including Lagash, and Nippur, depict scenes that correspond to narrative elements in these texts with enough consistency to suggest a shared visual vocabulary, a mythology stable enough across centuries to be represented iconographically. One recurring image shows two figures flanking a central tree or pillar, a composition that appears across Mesopotamian art for nearly 2,000 years and whose specific meaning continues to be debated. The seals are typically between 2 and 4 centimeters in height, carved from materials including lapis lazuli, carnelian, and hematite, and the detail achieved at that scale with the tools available is quietly extraordinary. The unanswered questions accumulate naturally as you move through this material. Why do the Anunnaki in the earliest texts seem constrained by circumstances rather than omnipotent? Why do they make mistakes, experience exhaustion, feel fear? Why does the flood in the Atrahasis epic occur not as divine punishment, but as a deliberate population control measure that Enki subverts by warning a single human? These are not the behaviors of beings who exist outside consequence. They are the behaviors of beings operating within it. The tablets hold these questions with the same patient indifference they have held everything else for 5,000 years, cool and dense in their museum cases, still giving up new meanings to every generation that learns to read them. Something in the oldest layers of this tradition points not upward toward transcendent divinity, but outward, toward arrival, toward purpose, toward a story that began somewhere other than here. Imagine standing at the edge of around 2100 BCE, looking toward the city center as the sun clears the eastern horizon. What you would see is not the modest reed and mud settlement of earlier centuries, but something that would register, even by modern standards, as genuinely impressive. The great ziggurat of commissioned by King Ur-Nammu and substantially completed by his son Shulgi, rose approximately 30 meters above the flat plain in 3 massive stepped terraces, each one faced with baked mud brick set in bitumen mortar, the outer surface still showing traces of the dark pigment applied to the lowest level, the middle terrace painted black, the upper terrace finished in fired brick of deep red. At its summit, a small temple called the Temen Niguru, the house whose foundation creates terror, housed the moon god Nana, patron deity of the city. The ziggurat measured 64 meters long, 45 meters wide at its base, and the brickwork required for its construction has been estimated at several million individual units. At its peak, during the Third Dynasty period from approximately 2112 to 2004 BCE, was home to somewhere between 65,000 and 100,000 people, making it one of the largest cities on Earth at the time. The city was organized with a sophistication that modern urban planners still find instructive. A walled sacred precinct at the center containing the ziggurat complex, royal tombs, and administrative buildings, surrounded by residential districts divided by narrow lanes, with a harbor district connected to a canal system that linked to the broader river network of southern Mesopotamia. The harbor handled goods arriving from the Persian Gulf, from the Indus Valley civilization to the east, from the copper-rich island of Dilmun, identified with modern Bahrain, and from sources even further afield. The administrative machinery that kept this system functioning was staggering in its detail. Thousands of tablets recovered from Ur and the nearby city of Girsu record grain allocations, labor assignments, livestock inventories, and temple income with an accounting precision that required professional scribes trained from childhood. In the Aduba, the tablet house, where students copied texts, solved mathematical problems, and memorized the canonical literature of Sumerian civilization. A scribal education lasted approximately 10 years and covered mathematics, including multiplication tables and square roots, astronomy, music, law, and the full corpus of mythological and religious texts, including the stories of the Anunnaki. The economy was temple-centered in ways that blurred distinctions modern minds tend to keep separate. The ziggurat complex was simultaneously a place of worship, a granary, a redistribution center, a workshop employing weavers and metalworkers and brewers, and an astronomical observatory whose priests tracked celestial cycles with instruments and methods we have only partially reconstructed. Temple records from Nippur show that the institution employed over 1,200 people in various capacities, from high priests conducting daily rituals to workers who swept the courtyard and maintained the drainage channels. Daily life for ordinary Sumerians was structured around a calendar of religious festivals that punctuated the agricultural year, with ceremony, music, procession, and communal eating. The New Year festival, the Akitu, lasted 11 days and included a ritual reenactment of cosmic events, including the establishment of divine order that directly referenced the Anunnaki's role in organizing existence. Participants processed through the city streets carrying divine statues, accompanied by musicians playing lyres, frame drums, and reed pipes, the sound carrying across the flat landscape for considerable distances in the dry air. The stars above Ur were not decorative. They were functional, calendrical, and deeply meaningful in ways that permeated every level of Sumerian society, from the king to the canal worker. Planetary movements were recorded systematically, interpreted by specialist priests called the Baru, and used to advise on everything from military campaigns to agricultural timing to the health of the king. Beneath all this visible achievement, beneath the accounting tablets and the ziggurat shadow and the festival music, something older and more fundamental was being continuously maintained. The memory of where civilization had come from and the anxiety encoded quietly in the texts about what might happen if that memory was lost. In the spring of 2047 BCE, a junior scribe named Ur-Nammatum reported to the Aduba at Nippur before sunrise, as he had done every morning for 6 years. He was 17 years old, the son of a mid-ranking temple administrator, and he was 3 months away from completing his formal education. The morning air carried the particular cool dampness of the Euphrates flood season, the smell of fresh silt and river water drifting through the narrow lanes of the temple district as he made his way to the tablet house, carrying his wooden writing board and his reed case. His assignment that morning was to copy, for the 4th time in his training, a portion of the text, now known to scholars as the Descent of Inanna, one of the canonical literary compositions every Sumerian scribe was required to master. The senior teacher, called the Umi'a, the expert, had set out the master tablet the previous evening, and Ur-Nammatum's task was to reproduce it on a fresh clay surface with sufficient accuracy to pass inspection. The text described the goddess Inanna's journey through 7 gates into the underworld, surrendering an article of clothing or jewelry at each gate until she arrived stripped of everything before her sister, Ereshkigal, Queen of the Dead. Ur-Nammatum had copied this text so many times he could recite portions of it from memory, his reed moving across the clay in the precise 45-degree angle the Umiya had spent months correcting, each wedge impression firm and consistent. The lines running parallel across the tablet's surface with the regularity of someone who had internalized the craft completely. He finished the tablet by mid-morning, set it on the drying rack with his name impressed in the corner, and moved to his next assignment. A mathematical problem involving the calculation of labor days required to dig a canal of specified dimensions. He would not have considered these two tasks categorically different. The literary text and the engineering calculation were both, in the Sumerian understanding, expressions of the ME, the divine laws of civilization, equally sacred, equally necessary, equally part of what the Anunnaki had deposited in human hands for safekeeping. The Nippur Aduba produced graduates who went on to staff temple administrations, royal courts, and trading houses across Mesopotamia. The literary curriculum they mastered was remarkably consistent across centuries, suggesting a deliberate conservatism, a conscious decision to transmit specific texts unchanged rather than allowing them to evolve freely. Among those canonical texts, the stories of the Anunnaki occupied a central position, not as entertaining mythology, but as foundational cosmology, the explanation of why civilization existed and what it was for. Imagine the weight of that. A 17-year-old boy copying a text that was already ancient by his time, participating in a chain of transmission that stretched back centuries before him and would continue centuries after. Each link in the chain, a human hand pressing clay, a human mind holding the words, a human community deciding that these particular stories were worth preserving at institutional scale. The cuneiform tablets recovered from Nippur alone number over 30,000 fragments, representing the largest single collection of Sumerian literary material ever found. Many preserve multiple copies of the same text, which allows scholars to reconstruct damaged passages by cross-referencing versions, a kind of textual archaeology that the scribes themselves, with their obsessive copying culture, inadvertently enabled. Ur-Nammatum's specific tablet has not survived, but tablets made by students exactly like him, in the same room during the same period, have. They sit in the collections of the University of Pennsylvania Museum and the Oriental Institute in Chicago, still carrying the fingerprints of their makers in the clay. The chain of transmission held across 4,000 years, waiting for someone on the other end to learn to read it. The Sumerians did not build their cities and then add astronomy as an afterthought. Astronomy and urban architecture were conceived together as expressions of the same underlying cosmological framework, a framework in which the movements of celestial bodies and the organization of human society were not parallel systems, but a single integrated one. The sky was not above the city. In the Sumerian understanding, the sky and the city were reflections of each other, each legitimizing and encoding the other's order. The ziggurat itself encodes this relationship physically. The 7 levels of the fully developed ziggurat form, as seen at later examples, including the ziggurat at Khorsabad and the reconstructed one at Babylon, corresponded in Mesopotamian cosmological thinking to the 7 celestial bodies visible to the naked eye: the moon, the sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Each level was associated with a specific deity and a specific metal, the highest with gold and the sun god, the lowest with lead and Saturn. Whether all Sumerian ziggurats were consciously designed with this correspondence in mind, or whether the association developed gradually over centuries, remains an open scholarly question. But the correspondence itself is documented in cuneiform sources, and was clearly operative in the tradition by the 2nd millennium BCE. Mesopotamian astronomers, working from temple observatories across the city network, developed mathematical models for predicting celestial events that modern historians of science consider genuinely sophisticated. The Saros cycle, an approximately 18-year period after which lunar eclipses repeat in the same pattern, was identified and documented by Babylonian astronomers working in a tradition that extended directly from Sumerian roots. The MUL.APIN tablets, a comprehensive astronomical compendium whose oldest versions date to around 1000 BCE, but encode observations from considerably earlier, catalog the risings and settings of 36 stars or star groups across the year, describe the paths of the moon and 5 planets, and provide mathematical methods for calculating intercalary months to keep the lunar calendar aligned with the solar year. These were not casual observations. They required systematic record-keeping across multiple generations, institutional support, and a theoretical framework sophisticated enough to distinguish between what had been observed and what could be predicted. The Anunnaki, in the astronomical texts, are consistently associated with specific celestial bodies. Anu, the sky, god and father of the Anunnaki, is associated with the pole of the ecliptic. Enlil's stars occupy the central band of the sky. Enki's stars occupy the southern sky near the horizon. The cosmos, in other words, was administratively divided among the Anunnaki in the same way that the earth was divided among them in the mythological texts. Imagine lying on the roof of a temple in Nippur on a clear autumn night around 2000 BCE, the city sounds settling into their nighttime quiet below you, the flat Mesopotamian landscape extending in every direction to a perfectly unobstructed horizon. The Milky Way overhead would be bright enough to cast faint shadows. Jupiter, associated with the chief god Marduk in later tradition, and with Enlil in earlier Sumerian sources, would be visible as a steady, non-twinkling point of light, moving gradually against the background stars over the course of weeks. A trained observer would know exactly where Jupiter should be on any given night, could detect deviations from predicted position, and would understand those deviations as messages requiring interpretation. The boundary between science and religion in this context is not a boundary the Sumerians would have recognized. Observation and interpretation, measurement and meaning, were the same activity performed by the same people for the same institutional purposes. The priests who calculated eclipse cycles were the same priests who conducted the rituals that the eclipse predictions informed. The knowledge was unified in a way that our modern disciplinary divisions make genuinely difficult to think about. What remains quietly remarkable is the stability of this knowledge tradition across the enormous span of Mesopotamian civilization, from the earliest Sumerian city-states around 3500 BCE to the final cuneiform tablets written in the 1st century CE, a period of 3,500 years during which the astronomical and mythological tradition remained recognizably continuous, despite political upheaval, conquest, and cultural transformation. Something in that tradition was considered too important to lose. Something was being maintained, carefully and deliberately, across an almost incomprehensible stretch of time. I'll expand sections 11, 12, and 13 with approximately 3,000 additional words, deepening the philosophical exploration, archaeological detail, and meditative texture of each. The Sumerian language occupies a peculiar and still not fully explained position in the history of human communication. It is a language isolate, meaning it has no demonstrated relationship to any other known language family, living or dead. Akkadian, which gradually replaced Sumerian as the spoken vernacular of Mesopotamia after approximately 2000 BCE, belongs to the Semitic family and is related to Arabic, Hebrew, and Aramaic. But Sumerian connects to nothing. Its grammar, its vocabulary, its phonological patterns have no parallels that comparative linguists have been able to establish with confidence, despite considerable effort over 150 years of research. This matters for our story in ways that are easy to underestimate. When a language has no relatives, it has no neighbors. It did not gradually differentiate from a proto-language shared with other communities, or if it did, those relatives left no recoverable trace. The Sumerians themselves were aware of their linguistic singularity, at least implicitly, because Sumerian was maintained as a ritual and literary language for 2,000 years after it ceased to be anyone's mother tongue, preserved by the scribal schools in the same way Latin was preserved in medieval Europe, as the sacred language of texts that mattered too much to allow to die. The Anunnaki texts were written in this preserved Sumerian, copied by scribes who were learning a dead language specifically to access them. The Epic of Gilgamesh exists in Sumerian, Akkadian, Hurrian, and Hittite versions, suggesting a tradition so important that multiple civilizations across a broad geographic range considered it worth translating and maintaining. The flood narrative, the story of the Anunnaki's decision to destroy humanity and Enki's decision to warn a single survivor, appears in enough separate textual traditions to constitute one of the most widely distributed stories in the ancient world. Imagine a room in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh around 650 BCE, where scholars employed by the Assyrian king were systematically copying older texts onto fresh tablets, preserving them against deterioration, organizing them by subject in a cataloging system whose logic archaeologists are still working to fully reconstruct. These scholars were working with Sumerian originals already 1,500 years old, in a language none of them spoke natively, translating and copying with the careful attention of people who understood they were handling something irreplaceable. The library held works on astronomy, medicine, divination, mathematics, history, and mythology, and at its center, the great narrative cycles involving the Anunnaki. Ashurbanipal himself, in inscriptions describing his library project, claimed to be able to read both Sumerian and Akkadian, to solve complex mathematical problems, and to interpret celestial omens, accomplishments he listed with evident pride as marks of royal distinction. The preservation of Anunnaki knowledge was, in his understanding, a kingly responsibility, part of what it meant to rule legitimately in the tradition of civilization the gods had established. The texts survived Nineveh's destruction by the Medes and Babylonians in 612 BCE because they were buried under the rubble of the burning palace. The very catastrophe that destroyed the city preserved the library by collapsing the roof over the tablets before the fire could reach them all. They lay there for 24 centuries, until Austin Henry Layard began excavating the mound of Kuyunjik in 1845 and started uncovering what would eventually be recognized as the most important textual archive of the ancient world. The language of the gods, as the Sumerians sometimes called their written tradition, had waited with the patience of buried things for someone to come along who could hear it again. And in those texts, beneath the hymns and the king lists and the mathematical tables, the Anunnaki were still moving, still purposeful, still carrying something forward through time that the people who wrote about them clearly believed could not be allowed to disappear. What that something was and where it came from is precisely where our journey deepens. But let us stay a moment longer with the language itself, because its strangeness is worth dwelling on before we move past it. The grammatical structure of Sumerian is what linguists call agglutinative, meaning it builds meaning by chaining morphemes together into long compound words rather than using the word order. Conventions of languages like English or the case-ending systems of languages like Latin. A single Sumerian verb can encode subject, object, indirect object, tense, aspect, and the divine or human status of the actors involved, all within one continuous word chain that a trained reader processes as a unit. The cognitive architecture required to produce and parse such a language is not simpler than the architecture required for English or Arabic. It is differently sophisticated, organized around different principles of how meaning assembles itself from parts. When scholars first began seriously decoding cuneiform in the 19th century, the existence of Sumerian as a non-Semitic layer beneath the Akkadian texts was itself a discovery of considerable surprise. The French scholar Jules Aupert proposed in 1869 that the older language embedded in the bilingual texts should be called Sumerian, after the ancient name Sumer, found in royal titularies. His colleagues debated for years whether Sumerian was a real language or a priestly cipher, a kind of sacred code invented by Babylonian priests to give their rituals an air of impenetrable antiquity. The idea of a genuine pre-Semitic civilization in Mesopotamia, fully literate and organizationally complex, was difficult for the 19th century scholarly imagination to absorb quickly. We know now that Sumerian was entirely real, spoken by a community whose ethnic and geographic origins remain genuinely unclear. The question of where the Sumerians came from before the historical record begins is one of the foundational unanswered questions of ancient history. The archaeological record shows a cultural continuity at sites like Eridu and Uruk, stretching back to the 6th millennium BCE, with no clear evidence of a population replacement or mass migration that would explain the sudden appearance of a linguistically isolated community in the river delta. One interpretation holds that the Sumerians were always there, developing their distinctive culture gradually from earlier Ubaid period populations. Another suggests they arrived from somewhere undetermined, bringing their language and their cosmological framework with them into a landscape already inhabited by other communities. The Sumerians themselves, characteristically, had an answer to this question. They came from Dilmun, a place described in their texts as a pure and sacred land where the sun rises, associated in most scholarly analyses with the island of Bahrain in the Persian Gulf, or with a broader region of the Arabian coastal zone. Dilmun in the texts is not simply a geographical location. It is a primordial condition, a state of original order before the complications of human civilization introduced noise and conflict into the world. The Anunnaki god Enki is intimately associated with Dilmun, and one of the oldest Sumerian literary compositions, known as Enki and Ninhursag, is set there, describing a world of uncorrupted abundance, before the cycles of growth and death fully establish themselves. Perhaps Dilmun was a memory of origin, a mythologized version of wherever the Sumerian cultural tradition first cohered before it arrived in the river delta. Perhaps it was a genuine geographical location whose pre-Sumerian inhabitants contributed something essential to the civilization that eventually named and remembered them. We may never recover enough evidence to choose confidently between these possibilities and others besides. What remains is the language itself, cool and strange, and irreducibly itself, holding its secrets in the same patient way it has always held them, waiting in the clay for whatever understanding the next generation of scholars might bring to bear on it. The stars above Nineveh were the same stars that had shone above Eridu 3,000 years earlier. The scribes copying dead texts in a dead language by lamplight were, whether they knew it or not, participating in a tradition of transmission that stretched back to the very beginning of writing itself. And the questions those texts contained, pressed into their surfaces with the same deliberate care in every generation, have not yet exhausted their capacity to generate new understanding in minds that encounter them for the first time. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing a language can do, not merely to communicate across space, from one living mind to another, but to communicate across time, from minds long gone to minds not yet born, carrying questions that remain alive precisely because they have never been fully answered. Beneath the administrative surface of Sumerian civilization, beneath the grain records and labor tallies and legal codes, there exists a layer of cosmological encoding so pervasive and so consistent that scholars across multiple disciplines have spent careers attempting to map its full extent. The Sumerians did not separate the sacred from the practical. They embedded cosmic meaning into measurements, into city layouts, into the very mathematics they used to calculate canal dimensions and beer rations. The hidden architecture of their world was not hidden because it was secret. It was hidden because it was everywhere, woven so thoroughly into ordinary life that it became invisible through familiarity. The Sumerian sexagesimal system, the base 60 mathematics that gave us our 60-minute hour, our 360-degree circle, and our 60-second minute, was not chosen arbitrarily. 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making it the most mathematically flexible base available to a pre-calculator civilization. But the system also encodes astronomical relationships with a precision that goes beyond practical convenience. The number 25,920, which appears in Sumerian mathematical tablets, corresponds to the length of one complete precession of the equinoxes in years, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the apparent position of the sun at the spring equinox to move backward through the zodiac at a rate of 1 degree every 72 years. That number required either extraordinary long-term astronomical observation or knowledge of the Earth's axial precession from some other source entirely. Mainstream scholarship attributes Mesopotamian mathematical sophistication to the accumulated observational tradition of generations of careful sky watchers, and that explanation is well supported by the evidence of systematic record-keeping, stretching back to the earliest Sumerian period. The alternative interpretation, advanced by researchers including Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Dechend in their 1969 work, Hamlet's Mill, proposes that precessional knowledge was encoded in mythology deliberately, preserved in narrative structures, specifically because stories survive where numerical tables do not. In their reading, the Anunnaki myths encode astronomical data in the movements and conflicts of their divine characters, each god corresponding to a celestial body, each narrative event to an astronomical configuration. The tranquility required to observe precession is almost incomprehensible. 1 degree of precessional movement takes 72 years, roughly a human lifetime. To detect it at all requires comparing observations made generations apart, which means maintaining institutional continuity, consistent methodology, and reliable record-keeping across centuries. The Sumerian temple system provided exactly that infrastructure, which is perhaps why the temples were rebuilt on the same spots for thousands of years rather than relocated. Hidden within the MUL.APIN astronomical tablets is a calendar system that divides the year into three paths across the sky: the path of Anu in the center, the path of Enlil in the north, and the path of Enki in the south. Each path containing specific stars and each associated with a specific Anunnaki figure. This tripartite division of the sky maps onto the tripartite division of cosmic authority described in the mythological texts with a consistency that suggests the astronomical and mythological systems were designed together as two expressions of the same underlying cosmological model. Perhaps the most quietly unsettling hidden dimension is the one that remains genuinely unexplained. Why does sophisticated mathematical and astronomical knowledge appear so fully formed in the earliest recoverable layers of Sumerian civilization, with so little visible developmental prehistory? Most technologies show clear archaeological evidence of gradual refinement. Sumerian mathematics appears, by roughly 3000 BCE, already operating at a level of sophistication that took other civilizations centuries more to reach independently. That question sits in the silence between the tablets, patient, unresolved, still waiting for a complete answer. Now let us go further into this hidden architecture, because the surface we have described so far is only the beginning of what the evidence suggests. The city of Nippur, the great religious center of Mesopotamia that remained sacred across multiple successive civilizations for over 3,000 years, was laid out according to a plan that archaeologists have spent decades attempting to fully reconstruct from excavation data. What they have recovered suggests a city whose orientation and internal organization encoded celestial alignments with a deliberateness that goes well beyond practical necessity. The central axis of the temple precinct at Nippur aligns within 1 degree of true north, an orientation that required either sophisticated surveying instruments or a computational method for deriving true north from stellar observations that we have not yet fully reconstructed. The Akur, the great temple of Enlil at Nippur, was called in the texts the House of the Mountain, and its summit was understood as the axis of the cosmos, the point where the earthly and celestial realms communicated most directly. The name itself, Ikur, combining the Sumerian words for house and mountain, encodes the architectural theology of the ziggurat form, a mountain built by human hands to serve as the meeting point between earth and sky, between the human and the divine, between what is known and what lies beyond the reach of ordinary perception. Measurements taken at Nippur by the archaeologist Hermann Hilprecht during the University of Pennsylvania expeditions of the 1880s and 1890s, and refined by subsequent surveys, revealed that the dimensions of the temple precinct at Nippur relate to the dimensions of the city as a whole by mathematical ratios that appear in Sumerian mathematical tablets as the basis for scaling calculations. The city was not planned and then described mathematically. The mathematics and the city plan were conceived together as a single integrated expression of cosmological order rendered in mud brick and canal, water. This integration of number, space, and cosmic meaning was not incidental decoration. It reveals a civilization that understood the physical environment it built as a kind of three-dimensional text, a spatial encoding of the same cosmological information that the written tablets encoded in wedge-shaped signs. A Sumerian priest moving through the temple precinct at Nippur was, in a very real sense, reading a text, moving through a structured argument about the nature of cosmic order and the city's place within it. Consider what that means for how we think about the transmission of the ME. If the divine laws of civilization were encoded not only in written tablets, but in the spatial organization of cities, in the proportional relationships of architectural elements, in the orientations of temple axes toward significant celestial events, then they were redundantly preserved in multiple media simultaneously. The loss of the written tradition would not have erased the spatial tradition. The destruction of the cities would not have erased the mathematical tradition preserved in tablets. Each medium served as a backup for the others, a distribution of irreplaceable content across multiple formats against the possibility of any single format's loss. This is sophisticated information management. It describes a civilization that had thought carefully about the problem of cultural continuity across catastrophe, and had developed systemic responses to it, responses built into the very structure of how they organized their cities, their mathematics, their mythology, and their architecture simultaneously. Whether that systematic approach to preserving knowledge was developed gradually through accumulated experience of floods and invasions, or whether it reflects something older, a tradition that had already survived one major interruption before the Sumerian period and was determined not to allow a second, remains one of the questions the evidence cannot currently resolve. The hidden architecture is there. Its full extent is still being mapped, and the people who built it, whatever else they were and wherever they came from, clearly understood something about the fragility of knowledge and the necessity of protecting it that feels, across 5,000 years, both alien and deeply familiar. Carved into cylinder seals, pressed into temple walls, woven into textile patterns, and repeated across 4,000 years of Mesopotamian art, with a consistency that speaks of deliberate preservation rather than casual tradition. Certain symbols appear in Sumerian visual culture with a frequency and stability that demands attention. The winged disc, the tree flanked by two figures, the eight-pointed star of Inanna, the crossed circle representing the four cardinal directions and four intercardinal points. These images appear in the earliest Sumerian archaeological layers and persist, recognizably unchanged, through Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and into Persian iconography. Some of them appear in forms close enough to prompt serious scholarly discussion in cultures with no documented contact with Mesopotamia. The winged disc deserves particular attention. In Sumerian and Akkadian tradition, it represents Shamash, the sun god, or in some contexts the supreme deity Asur, and it appears above royal inscriptions, temple entrances, and military standards throughout Mesopotamian history. The same symbol, sometimes with slight variations, appears in ancient Egyptian art as the winged sun disk of Horus, in Hittite religious iconography, in Achaemenid Persian royal imagery, and in the Indus Valley civilization at Mohenjo-Daro. Whether this distribution represents cultural diffusion along trade routes, independent parallel development, responding to similar astronomical observations, or something else entirely, remains one of the genuinely open questions in comparative iconography. Beneath the symbol's surface beauty, there may be encoded astronomical information. The disk with wings could represent the sun at the equinoxes, when the sun's path traces a horizontal line flanked by the rising arcs of spring and autumn, creating a visual form resembling spread wings. This interpretation is consistent with Mesopotamian astronomical practice and would make the winged disk a calendar marker of fundamental importance, visible to anyone who understood its referent. The eight-pointed star of Inanna, representing the planet Venus, encodes the pattern of Venus's appearances as morning and evening star across its synodic cycle of approximately 584 days. Over 8 years, Venus traces a near-perfect 5-pointed star pattern against the background of the zodiac. And over longer periods, the 8-pointed star pattern appears in its heliacal risings and settings. The Sumerian astronomers knew this. The Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa documents it explicitly. The symbol was not decorative. It was a compressed, astronomical record, a piece of scientific information rendered in a form that could be reproduced by artisans who may not have understood its technical content, but faithfully preserved its visual accuracy. Perhaps this is the hidden technology we most consistently underestimate: the capacity to encode complex information in symbols stable enough to survive the collapse of the civilization that generated them. The symbols outlasted the scribal schools, the temple administrations, the cities themselves. They persisted in forms that carried their content forward, even when the language needed to fully decode them was lost. The tree flanked by 2 figures, that recurring image on 10,000 cylinder seals, still has not yielded a single universally accepted interpretation. Mainstream scholars read it as a sacred tree ritual, a scene of divine presentation, a mythological narrative moment. Alternative researchers see in it a consistent depiction of the Anunnaki in a specific, relational configuration with a third element, perhaps the ME, perhaps a piece of transferred knowledge, perhaps simply a moment of instruction. The image endures in its repose, carved into objects small enough to hold in one hand, patient across the millennia, still declining to give up its final meaning. Now let us go deeper into the question of what these symbols were actually doing in the hands of the people who made and used them, because that question opens into something philosophically rich that a surface reading of the iconographic evidence tends to miss. The cylinder seal itself, as a technology, is worth pausing on. A cylinder seal is a small stone cylinder, typically between 2 and 6 centimeters in height and 1 to 3 centimeters in diameter, carved in intaglio so that rolling it across wet clay produces a raised impression of the design. Seals were used to mark ownership, to authenticate documents, and to indicate the identity of the person authorizing a transaction. Every significant person in Sumerian society had one, and the designs carved into them were not chosen casually. The seal was, in a sense, a compressed identity. It encoded in a few square centimeters of carved stone the visual vocabulary that its owner wanted associated with their name and authority. And the overwhelming frequency of Anunnaki-related imagery in seal designs across thousands of years and dozens of city-states tells us something important. Associating oneself with the Anunnaki tradition was, for the people of ancient Mesopotamia, a way of claiming legitimacy, of situating oneself within the cosmic order that the Anunnaki had established. A merchant pressing his seal into a clay tablet recording a grain transaction was, in his own understanding, invoking that cosmic order as a guarantee of the transaction's validity. The symbol of the winged disc above the scene was not decoration. It was a witness, the same cosmic authority that had established the ME now observing. And legitimizing this particular exchange within the ordered system the ME maintained. The sacred and the commercial were not separate registers requiring different vocabularies. They were aspects of the same unified cosmological system, and the symbols moved fluently between them. Archaeologists studying seal impressions from the Ur-3 period, roughly 2112 to 2004 BCE, have identified over 3,000 distinct seal designs from administrative contexts alone, representing the working seals of officials, merchants, and temple administrators across the bureaucratic system of the Third Dynasty. Examined collectively, these designs show a remarkable consistency in their symbolic vocabulary alongside considerable variation in compositional details, suggesting a shared iconographic tradition, flexible enough to accommodate personal expression while maintaining the structural integrity of its core symbols. The crossed circle, 4 quadrants divided by a vertical and horizontal axis, appears in Sumerian contexts as early as the Uruk period, around 3500 BCE, and continues through the entire span of Mesopotamian civilization. It represents simultaneously the 4 cardinal directions, the 4 seasons, the division of the year into quarters marked by solstices and equinoxes, and the administrative division of cosmic territory among the Anunnaki. A single symbol carrying 4 distinct but related meanings, each one reinforcing and contextualizing the others, is not accidental visual economy. It is sophisticated symbolic design, the compression of a complex cosmological statement into a form that can be carved into a seal 1 centimeter across and still communicate its full content to an informed viewer. This compression is, in a very real sense, a form of information technology. The symbols were not primitive attempts at communication by people who lacked better tools. They were refined solutions to the problem of encoding maximum meaning in minimum space, developed over centuries of use and refinement by communities that understood information preservation as a matter of civilizational survival. Take a breath here and consider that framing for a moment. If the symbols were information technology, then the people who designed, maintained, and transmitted them were, in their own way, doing something not entirely different from what modern engineers do when they design data compression algorithms or redundant storage systems. They were solving the problem of how to preserve critical information across time and across the catastrophic interruptions that time inevitably brings. The specific content of that information was cosmological rather than computational, but the underlying problem and the systematic intelligence brought to solving it bears a resemblance to modern concerns that is more than superficially interesting. The symbols that refused to die did so because they were designed not to die. They were built for survival, encoded in materials, chosen for durability, reproduced at scales of volume that made comprehensive destruction nearly impossible, and embedded in social practices, commercial transactions, royal legitimation, religious ritual that ensured their continuous active use rather than passive storage. A symbol in daily use is far harder to lose than a symbol stored in a library. The Sumerians understood this, and they put their most important cosmological content into the symbols that appeared on every seal, every temple wall, every textile border, every royal inscription. The winged disc still appears above the entrance to certain buildings in the Middle East, its meaning attenuated now to general notions of divine protection or royal authority, most of its astronomical content long since separated from the visual form that originally carried it. The 8-pointed star appears in Islamic geometric art in forms whose Sumerian astronomical ancestry is almost entirely invisible to the people who create and admire them today. The crossed circle appears in contexts ranging from Celtic metalwork to Pueblo pottery, each instance carrying whatever meaning its local tradition has assigned to it. The original Sumerian cosmological content present only as a structural ghost in the visual form. The symbols survived. Their full original meaning did not survive with them, or at least has not survived in any recoverable continuous tradition. And that gap between the persistence of the form and the attenuation of the content is perhaps the most quietly moving dimension of the entire story. The Sumerians succeeded at the first part of their preservation project, and only partially at the second. The containers endured. Some of what they contained has required 5,000 years of scholarly effort to partially reconstruct, and the reconstruction is still incomplete. What remains in the stillness of that incompleteness is not failure. It is an invitation, still open, still patient, still extending itself toward anyone willing to sit long enough with the symbols to hear what they are still, very quietly, trying to say. Modern archaeological technology has transformed what we can know about ancient Mesopotamia without lifting a single trowel from the soil. Satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and LiDAR surveys conducted over the past 2 decades have revealed the outlines of cities, canal systems, and structures buried beneath the Iraqi and Iranian plains at a scale and density that has genuinely surprised researchers. A 2019 survey using declassified corona satellite imagery from the 1960s, analyzed by a team including archaeologist Jesse Kasana at Dartmouth College, identified over 14,000 previously unrecorded archaeological sites across the broader Fertile Crescent region, most of them unexcavated, and many of them predating the known Sumerian cities by centuries. Beneath the surface of the ancient landscape, buried under meters of alluvial sediment, deposited by thousands of years of river flooding, there are structures, communities, and artifacts that may substantially revise the current understanding of how Sumerian civilization developed and what preceded it. The transition from scattered agricultural villages to fully organized urban civilization, the period archaeologists call the Uruk expansion, occurred between approximately 4,000 and 3,100 BCE, with a speed that remains difficult to fully account for, using only the evidence currently available. Something accelerated during the Uruk period, and the full shape of what that something was remains hidden beneath the soil. The ancient city of Eridu, identified as the first city in Sumerian tradition, sits on a geological feature called the Hammer Depression, a region that was, during the period of early Sumerian settlement, at the edge of a substantial body of water, possibly a freshwater lake, or a northern extension of the Persian Gulf. Geological surveys conducted in the 1990s and 2000s have confirmed that the ancient shoreline ran considerably further north and west than the present coast, and that the region now covered by the northern Persian Gulf was dry land as recently as 8,000 years ago, potentially supporting human settlement in areas now submerged under 10 to 20 meters of water. What lies beneath those waters is genuinely unknown. No systematic underwater archaeological survey of the northern Persian Gulf has been conducted with sufficient coverage or resolution to characterize the submerged landscape. The possibility that evidence of pre-Sumerian settlement, perhaps substantially older than anything currently in the archaeological record, lies on the floor of that shallow sea is not fringe speculation. It is an acknowledged gap in the evidence that researchers, including Jeffrey Rose of the University of Birmingham, have written about seriously in peer-reviewed literature. Perhaps the Sumerian flood narratives, preserved in the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh flood story, encode a genuine cultural memory of coastal inundation, the slow or sudden loss of inhabited land to rising post-glacial sea levels that occurred between approximately 14,000 and 6,000 BCE as the great ice sheets melted. The floods described in the texts are consistently associated with divine decision and Anunnaki agency, but the physical backdrop, rising waters, the destruction of a previous world, the survival of knowledge in a vessel, maps onto the genuine geological history of the region with uncomfortable precision. The hidden dimension here is temporal as much as spatial. What if the Sumerian tradition was not the beginning of the story it told, but a retelling of something older, a preservation of knowledge that had already survived one catastrophic interruption before the clay tablets were ever made? That question rests in the silence beneath the surveys and the soil cores, patient as the water that covered the land, waiting for the technology or the courage to look directly at it. I'll expand the existing sections from the document with approximately 3,000 additional words, distributed across sections 15, 16, 17, and 18, deepening the philosophical exploration and meditative texture of the closing movement. The most fundamental question the Anunnaki tradition raises is one that mainstream scholarship and alternative research share. Even if they answer it differently, where did the knowledge come from? The Sumerians themselves were consistent on this point across thousands of tablets and hundreds of years of textual tradition. The ME, the civilizing forces, the specific packages of knowledge that made urban civilization possible, were not invented by humans. They were given, deposited, entrusted. The question of who did the entrusting and from where they came is where the interpretations diverge. Mainstream Assyriologists, including scholars like Thorkild Jacobson, Samuel Noah Kramer, and more recently, Andrew George at University College London, read the Anunnaki as a sophisticated theological pantheon, divine beings who personify natural forces and cosmic principles in the way that most ancient religious traditions personify what is beyond human control. In this reading, the gift of civilization is a mythological explanation for a real historical process. The gradual accumulation of agricultural, astronomical, and organizational knowledge by human communities over many generations. The gods are real as symbols, real as psychological and social forces, but not real as literal visitors. A different scholarly tradition, represented by researchers including David Rohl and before him Zecharia Sitchin, proposes that the Anunnaki texts preserve, beneath their mythological surface, a memory of actual contact with beings of non-local origin. Sitchin's specific translations are disputed by professional cuneiformists, and that dispute matters and deserves acknowledgement. But the underlying pattern he identified, a tradition that consistently describes civilization as received rather than developed, beings arriving with specific knowledge and specific agendas, a cosmos organized around the idea of external governance. That pattern is real and present in the texts, regardless of how one interprets it. Perhaps the most honest position is the one that holds both possibilities without forcing a resolution. Maybe the Sumerians were doing what all human cultures do, projecting agency and personality onto the forces that shape their world. Or maybe they were doing something rarer, recording, in the only medium available to them, an encounter with something their descendants would struggle to believe. We may never know which of these is closer to the truth. What we do know is that the Sumerians themselves did not experience uncertainty on this point. They were confident. The gods had come. The knowledge had been given. Civilization was the result. The anxiety encoded in their texts was not about whether the Anunnaki were real. It was about whether what they left behind could be kept safe. That confidence, across 5,000 years of distance, still carries a weight that is difficult to dismiss entirely. There is a third dimension to this question that rarely receives the attention it deserves. When we ask where the knowledge came from, we are implicitly assuming that knowledge has a single point of origin, a moment of invention that can be located in time and attributed to a specific mind or community. But the Sumerian understanding of the ME suggests something different. The ME were not invented. They were not discovered in the way a mineral deposit is discovered. They existed prior to human civilization, prior to the Earth itself in some textual formulations, as fundamental properties of an ordered cosmos. The Anunnaki did not create them. They administered them, carried them, protected them, and in some narratives competed over their custody. This is a genuinely unusual cosmological proposition. It suggests that civilization, in the deepest Sumerian understanding, was not a human achievement at all. It was a natural property of the universe, like gravity or the orbital period of Venus, something that existed independently of any mind that recognized it, and that could be accessed, transmitted, or lost, depending on the choices of those entrusted with its care. Imagine what it would mean to live inside that understanding. Every scribal student copying the flood narrative was not simply preserving a story. He was maintaining a piece of cosmic infrastructure. Every temple administrator recording grain allocations was not simply doing accounting. He was enacting one of the ME, the divine law of organized distribution, without which the social order dissolved into chaos. The entire apparatus of Sumerian civilization was, in its own self-understanding, a mechanism for keeping the fundamental properties of ordered existence active and accessible in the world. Perhaps that explains the extraordinary conservatism of the scribal tradition, the insistence on copying texts unchanged, the resistance to innovation in canonical literature that sometimes frustrates modern literary sensibilities. If the ME were properties of the cosmos rather than human inventions, then altering their textual expression was not creative improvement, but dangerous corruption. The scribes were not librarians preserving old books. They were, in their own understanding, custodians of something that the universe itself required to be maintained. We may never fully reconstruct the inner experience of a Sumerian priest standing in the temple at Nippur before dawn, conducting rituals whose meaning he understood as cosmically necessary rather than merely culturally significant. But the texts he left behind give us enough to sense the outline of that experience, the weight of it, the particular combination of privilege and responsibility that comes with believing you are maintaining something the world cannot afford to lose. That feeling, interestingly, is not entirely foreign to us. Scientists preserving seed banks against agricultural collapse, archivists digitizing fragile manuscripts, astronomers monitoring near-Earth objects for potential impact. These are all expressions of the same underlying impulse. The conviction that certain knowledge is too important to allow to disappear, and that someone must take responsibility for its continuity. The Sumerians simply believed the stakes were higher than we typically allow ourselves to imagine. The title of our journey tonight contains a question that the Sumerian texts themselves seem to ask, without fully answering. If the Anunnaki arrived with urgency, if they carried knowledge forward with the deliberate intensity of beings preserving something against loss, if their mythology consistently frames civilization as something deposited rather than grown, what were they moving away from? Several interpretations exist, and each deserves a moment of genuine consideration. Some scholars working in the archaeoastronomy tradition, including Victor Klube and Bill Napier in their work on coherent catastrophism, have proposed that ancient mythological traditions worldwide encode memories of catastrophic encounters with cometary debris, periods of intense bombardment that caused widespread destruction and left deep psychological imprints on surviving populations. In this reading, the Anunnaki's urgency, the flood narratives, the repeated theme of destruction followed by deliberate reconstruction of civilization, reflects a genuine historical trauma, a sky that periodically became dangerous, and a consequent cultural obsession with astronomical monitoring and the preservation of knowledge against future catastrophe. Others suggest the answer lies closer to Earth. The abrupt end of the Younger Dryas period around 9700 BCE, when global temperatures rose by approximately 10 degrees Celsius in less than a decade, according to ice core evidence from Greenland, caused coastline changes, ecosystem collapses, and population displacements of a scale difficult to fully comprehend. Maybe what the Anunnaki were escaping, in this interpretation, was not a cosmic threat, but a terrestrial one. The rapid inundation of a coastal civilization whose physical remains now lie beneath the Persian Gulf. A third interpretation, held within mainstream scholarship, is that the escaping framing is itself a modern projection. The Anunnaki were not escaping anything. They were, in the textual tradition, governing, laboring, creating, and occasionally making decisions with catastrophic consequences. The urgency we read into their mythology may say more about what we are looking for than about what the Sumerians intended to convey. Perhaps all three interpretations are partially correct. Perhaps the texts encode multiple layers of meaning simultaneously: astronomical data, historical memory, theological framework, and philosophical meditation, all compressed into narratives simple enough to memorize and complex enough to reward centuries of study. We may never fully separate those layers, and maybe that is precisely the point. Mystery, held with patience and genuine curiosity rather than frustration, has a value that resolution sometimes cannot match. The Anunnaki remain just beyond the edge of what we can confirm. And that borderland is exactly where the most interesting questions tend to live. But let us sit a little longer with the escaping question, because it opens into something philosophically interesting, regardless of which interpretation one finds most compelling. Every civilization that has achieved sufficient complexity has eventually confronted the possibility of its own ending. The Egyptians built their monuments with an explicit awareness that time erodes all things, and that only stone properly inscribed might outlast the civilization that created it. The Greeks encoded their understanding of cyclical time in the myth of ages, gold declining through silver and bronze to iron, each age less ordered and more chaotic than the one before. The Hindus conceived of the Kali Yuga, the dark age at the end of a cosmic cycle, as a period of forgetting and dissolution that inevitably follows the brightness of earlier epochs. The Sumerians, unusually, framed this anxiety not as an abstract philosophical meditation, but as a narrative of active agency. The Anunnaki were not passive witnesses to civilizational decline. They were actors who had tried to prevent it, who had made choices, some helpful and some catastrophic, in the attempt to maintain order against entropy. Enki's decision to warn Atrahasis of the flood was not an act of divine mercy in the conventional sense. It was an act of preservation, the rescue not primarily of a man, but of the knowledge and genetic continuity that the man carried, the seeds of civilization protected in a vessel against the waters of dissolution. Take a breath here. Let that image rest with you for a moment. A vessel on dark water. Knowledge preserved against catastrophe. The deliberate choice to save what matters most, even at the cost of everything else. That image is not unique to Mesopotamia. It appears, in forms close enough to be more than coincidental, in the flood narratives of over 200 separate cultural traditions worldwide, from the Okanagan people of the Pacific Northwest to the Oghuz traditions of Central Asia, from the Vedic tradition of ancient India to the pre-Columbian traditions of Mesoamerica. The specific details vary. The underlying structure, a world ends, a vessel carries survivors and knowledge through the destruction, a new world begins from what was preserved, remains remarkably consistent. One interpretation suggests this distribution reflects a single historical event, catastrophic enough and recent enough in geological terms to have left its mark on the oral traditions of human communities across a broad geographic range before those communities separated sufficiently to develop distinct cultural identities. The end of the Younger Dryas, the rapid sea level rise of the early Holocene, the possible cometary impact events proposed by researchers including the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis team, who published evidence in 2018 of a large impact event around 12,800 BCE in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, all represent candidate events of sufficient magnitude. A second interpretation holds that flood narratives are a natural psychological response to the universal human experience of catastrophic flooding, which river delta civilizations in particular experienced with regularity, and that their cross-cultural consistency reflects shared human psychology rather than shared historical memory. Both interpretations may be correct in different proportions for different traditions. The Sumerian flood narrative, located precisely in a river delta region that genuinely flooded catastrophically and repeatedly, may encode both a specific historical memory and a universal psychological truth simultaneously, which would explain its extraordinary durability and its capacity to resonate across cultures that have never read a cuneiform tablet. What the Anunnaki were escaping, if they were escaping anything, may ultimately be the same thing every civilization fears. The moment when the accumulated knowledge of generations meets a force large enough to erase it, and the desperate, dignified, profoundly human response of trying to ensure that something survives. The stars above the flood would have been the same stars, cold, undisturbed, tracing their ancient patterns across a sky that registered the catastrophe below with perfect indifference. And perhaps that indifference was itself a kind of comfort, evidence that the cosmos continued, that order persisted at the scale of planets and orbits, even when it collapsed at the scale of cities and dynasties. The Anunnaki watched those stars and kept their records. Whatever they were running from, they were also running toward something, the continuation of a tradition they considered too important to surrender to the dark water. The knowledge did not die when the cities fell. It moved, as knowledge always does when the institutions that housed it collapse, into other containers, into the minds of traveling scribes who carried their training with them across borders, into the libraries of conquerors who recognized the value of what they had seized, into the oral traditions of communities who no longer had access to writing, but retained in the rhythms of their stories and rituals the structural memory of what those stories had once meant. The Anunnaki tradition survived the fall of Ur, survived the end of the Sumerian language as a spoken tongue, survived the Assyrian conquests and the Babylonian Empire and the Persian absorption of Mesopotamia, because it had been copied so many times, in so many places, by so many hands, that no single catastrophe could erase it entirely. The chain of transmission had redundancy built into it, perhaps deliberately. When Alexander the Great's armies moved through Mesopotamia in 331 BCE, the cuneiform scribal tradition was still alive, maintained by small communities of specialists in cities like Babylon, Nippur, and Uruk. Babylonian astronomers were still using mathematical methods rooted in Sumerian observational traditions to calculate planetary positions and predict eclipses with accuracy that impressed Greek scholars who encountered them. The Greek historian Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing around 290 BCE, produced a history of Mesopotamia in Greek that described the Anunnaki tradition directly, including the story of a being called Oannes, described as a creature of combined human and fish form, who emerged from the Persian Gulf in Decimciu, the earliest times, and taught humanity the arts of civilization, writing, mathematics, agriculture, and law, before returning to the water each evening. Even now, 2,300 years after Berossus wrote that account, scholars debate what Oannes represents. Some identify him with the Sumerian god Enki, whose domain was the Abzu, the freshwater deep, and whose association with wisdom, water, and civilization is consistent throughout the tradition. Others see in the Oannes story a compressed memory of cultural transmission from a seafaring civilization, knowledge arriving by water from a direction the early Mesopotamians associated with the unknown. The debate continues in academic journals and conference papers, still unresolved, still generative. The physical tablets themselves entered their long sleep beneath the soil of Iraq and Iran somewhere between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, as the last cuneiform scribal communities dissolved and the writing system was finally abandoned after 3,000 years of continuous use. For roughly 16 centuries, the entire textual tradition of Mesopotamian civilization was inaccessible, buried under tells that local people knew as ancient but could not read. Still today, the majority of excavated tablets sit in museum storage awaiting translation, and the majority of Mesopotamian archaeological sites remain unexcavated, their contents intact beneath the surface. The modern rediscovery began in earnest in the 1840s, with Layard's excavations at Nineveh and Nimrud, and accelerated through the work of scholars, including Henry Rawlinson, who deciphered the Bayesian inscription and opened the door to reading cuneiform, and Samuel Noah Kramer, whose 20th century translations of Sumerian literary texts gave the general public its first real access to the Anunnaki stories in their original form. Kramer's 1956 book, History Begins at Sumer, remains a foundational text, and even now his translations are being refined and in some cases substantially revised as the field advances. Still today, new tablets are being read for the first time. Still today, excavations at sites, including Girsu, ancient Lagash, directed by Sebastian Ray of the British Museum, are uncovering structures and artifacts that add new dimensions to the picture. Still today, the stars that the Sumerian astronomers watched and recorded wheel overhead in the same patterns, shifted slightly by 5,000 years of precession, but recognizably continuous, the same planets moving through the same zodiacal band that the Baru priests monitored from their temple rooftops. The continuity is not metaphorical, it is literal. The sky the Sumerians watched is the sky above you right now. What strikes me, sitting with this tradition across the distance of all those centuries, is how thoroughly the Sumerians succeeded at the one thing their texts suggest they cared about most. They wanted the knowledge to survive. They wanted the stories to persist. They built their scribal schools and their redundant copying practices and their temple libraries precisely because they understood that civilizations are mortal even when their knowledge need not be. And here we are, 5,000 years later, still reading their tablets, still debating their meanings, still feeling the weight of their questions, as though they were asked yesterday, rather than in a language that no one has spoken natively for 3 millennia. That is an extraordinary success by any measure. The Anunnaki tradition accomplished what its custodians most desperately wanted it to accomplish. It survived. Consider what did not survive from the same period: the oral traditions of dozens of contemporary cultures, the knowledge systems of communities that did not develop writing or whose writing has not been recovered, the astronomical observations of civilizations whose records were made in perishable materials rather than clay. All of these are gone, beyond recovery. The Sumerians' insistence on pressing everything into durable material, their almost compulsive documentation of every transaction and ritual and narrative, was not bureaucratic excess. It was, in retrospect, an act of civilizational self-preservation of remarkable foresight. Even now, the tradition continues to expand rather than close. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, a project based at Oxford University, has made thousands of cuneiform texts available in transliteration and translation for the first time, accessible to anyone with an internet connection. Scholars including Nick Veldhuis at Berkeley and Gonzalo Rubio at Penn State are developing increasingly sophisticated computational tools for analyzing patterns across the entire corpus, finding connections and structures that individual human readers working with physical tablets could never have detected. The tradition the Sumerian scribes began is being continued by people in offices and laboratories they could not have imagined, using tools that would have seemed indistinguishable from the ME themselves. And perhaps that is the most quietly moving thing about this entire story. The chain of transmission that began with a reed pressed into river mud by human hands in the marshes of southern Iraq has never actually broken. It has changed containers many times, from clay to papyrus to parchment to print to digital archive, but the content, the questions, the cosmological orientation, the reaching toward the sky, and the insistence that what is found there matters enough to preserve, that has continued without interruption from the first Sumerian scribe to the last person who read a translation of the Atrahasis epic before going to sleep. The story that began in the reed marshes of southern Iraq, pressed into wet clay by hands that have been dust for 50 centuries, continues in every person who looks up at the night sky and feels, without quite being able to explain, why that something up there is worth paying attention to. It continues, quietly, in you. Let the weight of all of that settle now, gently, without effort, the way silt settles through still water, finding its natural resting place at the bottom of things. You have traveled a considerable distance tonight, through deep time and lost cities, through the reed marshes of a world that no longer exists in any form you could visit, through the hands of scribes and the minds of priests, and the patient accumulation of a tradition that refused across every conceivable obstacle to disappear entirely. That journey is complete. There is nowhere else you need to go. The ruins of Eridu still rise slightly above the flat southern Iraqi plain. Not dramatically, not in a way that would stop a passing traveler in their tracks, but perceptibly, a low mound of eroded mud brick and accumulated human history, sitting quietly in a landscape of extraordinary emptiness. The wind moves across it in the Ahi, same direction it has always moved, carrying fine dust from the same desert that surrounded the city when it was alive. No one tends it tonight. No priests conduct their rituals on its ancient surface. But the ground holds what it holds, patiently, without any need for acknowledgement. The Tigris and Euphrates still run, diminished now by dams and irrigation withdrawals, but still following the courses that the Igigi supposedly dug in the oldest stratum of the tradition, still depositing their thin annual layers of silt across the alluvial plain, still connecting the mountains of eastern Turkey to the Persian Gulf in one continuous gesture of water finding its level. The rivers do not remember the Sumerians, but they carry in their chemistry and their sediment the physical residue of every civilization that has ever drawn from them. Somewhere beneath the shallow waters of the northern Persian Gulf, in depths between 10 and 40 meters, the landscape of an older world lies undisturbed. Whatever communities existed there, whatever knowledge they may have carried, whatever relationship they may have had with the traditions that eventually crystallized into the Sumerian texts, it rests in a tranquility more complete than any archive, more patient than any library. The water above it is not dark. In daylight, it is turquoise and clear. At night, it reflects the same stars that reflected in it 10,000 years ago, when it was still dry land, and people perhaps stood on it and looked up with the same biological eyes, the same pattern-seeking minds, the same wordless sense that the sky above them was trying to communicate something important. Notice your own breathing now. It has probably slowed without your having asked it to. That is what deep time does to the human nervous system when we allow it to work, when we stop fighting the scale of things and simply let the immensity settle around us like the desert settles around the old mound at Eridu. There is nothing threatening in that immensity. It is simply the true size of the world we actually inhabit, most of the time invisible behind the urgent smallness of daily life, but always there, always patient, always available to anyone who takes a moment to look past the immediate foreground. The Anunnaki, in whatever form they truly existed, whether as theological constructions of extraordinary sophistication, or as memories of something the ancient mind reached toward and could only partially describe, or as something else entirely that we have not yet found the right framework to consider. They have done what all things do, eventually. They have become part of the deep background of human consciousness, present in our 60-minute hours and our 360-degree circles, in our instinct to look upward when we feel the weight of questions too large for ordinary language, in our persistent sense that civilization is something fragile and precious that must be deliberately maintained and passed forward. You carry that inheritance tonight, without having chosen it, without needing to understand it fully. It arrived in you the same way the ME arrived in the Sumerian tradition, already there, already operative, already quietly shaping the questions you find yourself drawn to in the still hours when the day's noise has finally faded. The curiosity that brought you here tonight, to this particular journey through ancient time, is itself part of the tradition. It is the same impulse that drove the scribes of Nippur to copy texts they already knew by heart, the same orientation toward meaning that the Baru priests expressed in their patient nightly observations of the sky. You are, in a very real sense, a continuation of something that has been running unbroken for 5,000 years. You rest in that continuity now, and you don't need to hold it consciously. It holds itself. The stars are still there above whatever roof is above you now. The same patterns, shifted, slightly by the slow precession of millennia, but continuous, unbroken, watching with the patience of things that measure time in units larger than worry. Jupiter moves against the background stars on its 12-year cycle, as it did when Sumerian astronomers recorded its position on clay tablets by lamplight. Venus traces its elegant 8-year pattern of morning and evening appearances, the the pattern encoded in Inanna's 8-pointed star, still accurate, still running, still beautiful in its mathematical precision. The moon completes its Saros cycle of 18 years and 11 days, as predictable as it was when the first Babylonian astronomer recognized the pattern and understood that the sky was not random but rhythmic, not chaotic, but deeply, patiently ordered. That order is the last thing the Sumerian tradition wants to leave you with tonight. Not the specific claims of any particular interpretation, not the urgency of unanswered questions, not even the wonder of the mysteries themselves, but the underlying assurance that order persists, that the cosmos continues its patient, unhurried business regardless of what rises and falls beneath it, that the same sky that watched Eridu being built and watched it slowly return to dust watches you now with the same undivided, impersonal, somehow comforting attention. Let your breathing slow to match that patience. Let the questions rest where they are, not abandoned, but held lightly, the way the clay holds the impression of the stylus without straining, the way the desert holds the ruins without grieving, the way the deep water holds its secrets without needing anyone to know them. The wind moves across the old stones. The water carries its silt toward the sea. And somewhere in the deep archive of what it means to be human, a scribe presses a reed into wet clay, and the first word of an ancient story